From MeatEater's World News headquarters in Bozeman, Montana, this is Cal's Week in Review with Ryan Cal Callahan. Here's Cal.
What is happening, all you, Cal the Wild, Cal's Week in Review fans? As promised, I have my friend Eric Crawford of Trout Unlimited on the horn with us to go through this incredibly huge, diverse topic of what right now is a question, a proposal of how and why removal of the four lower Snake River dams would make sense, and why, and kind of like the how we could get those things out of there and account for the things that we talked about on the last podcast, which would be we want to have healthy outgoing salmon and steelhead and healthy incoming salmon and steelhead. So returning fisheries to a healthier state. We want to figure out the big question mark of those are hydroelectric dams. They're creating power. How do we replace that power? Shipping component, which there's a port, I think our furthest inland port, 465 miles from the ocean. So you can take an ocean going ship all the way to Lewiston, Idaho, 465 miles, river miles inland through this system of locks that would also go away at those four dams. So how do you replace the shipping benefits, capabilities that are currently in place? And then one of the things that came out of this trip to Lewiston with Eric Crawford that I, just didn't quite have any real understanding of is this United States government obligation to the Nez Perce people to uphold their end of a treaty, a federal agreement document between the sovereign nation of the Nez Perce and the United States government that says there's going to be salmon in the river for the people. And one of the amazing, fascinating things that I learned speaking with Chairman Wheeler of the Nez Perce tribe is that document, the intent of that document is to be upheld as if it were the time of the signing of that treaty, which to me, I would interpret that to mean that it's not just salmon in the river, it's wild salmon in the river. So we're not talking, hatchery fish is like a add-on thing, a placeholder maybe. But when you're talking about that treaty, you're talking about wild fish. So Eric, what do you do for Trout Unlimited?
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. I am the Snake River campaign director for Trout Unlimited. So oversee our broader campaign within the region to remove the four lower Snake River dams and then ultimately recover wild salmon and steelhead to the Snake River Basin while restoring a free-flowing river in the lower Snake corridor.
And so that, the way you look at it is your job to promote the removal of those dams. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that definitely is accurate, with a little bit of a caveat that we at Trout Unlimited really support a comprehensive solution. So addressing all those issues that you just brought up, transportation, energy, irrigation, recreation, none the least upholding, holding the federal government responsible for their obligations for treaty rights for the tribes throughout the Columbia Basin, specifically, as we learned last week, how important those fish are to the Nez Perce tribe. And so all of that wrapped into one in various aspects, whether it's outreach and engagement with local interests representing the agricultural sector, the irrigation sector, not only our membership within TU, our grassroots, grass tops, but then also all the way from local electeds up to congressionals. So a very broad swath of duties that I help direct and oversee and participate in my role as director of the campaign.
And yeah, I got a little foggy brain here today, folks. But if you're fuming already listening to this, I did forget the irrigation component, which is a huge point of concern for a lot of folks in the lower of the lower Snake River dams. Um, and I say lower of the lower because that's really where the significant irrigation withdrawal comes out of, correct?
Yeah, that's correct, Ryan. It's down at the Ice Harbor Pool. There's about 60,000 irrigated acres of agriculture down there. That there needs to be a solution of how do you get that water onto those crops um, in a different system than what it is today. You know, a reservoir system to a free flowing river system down there. So a whole caveat of services that need to be replaced. And I mean, in reality, the good news is that there is a very concerted effort by the federal government now through what is called the Six Sovereigns Agreement, and specifically U.S. government commitments to replace the majority of those services. So we're seeing that happening currently, and so hopefully we'll continue to see progress in that aspect. And really, this is the first time in really the history of the Lower Snake River Dam. So about almost 50 years, you know, plus or minus a couple, since the completion of Lower Granite Dam, which is the upper dam in the hydro system. That conversation has really changed about not just breach and not just about fish, but replacement of services, and really tying it all together to put our best foot forward in the region.
And how has your best foot forward been received so far?
Well, I mean, there definitely are folks that at least in my conversations that want to stick their head in the sand and just hope that it goes away. This discussion about breach just goes away, and that we can just maintain the status quo as it is. There are others that are interested in engaging cautiously, but really those conversations have changed tenfold since there's a progression of effort here within the region, within the country, to breach these four Lower Snake River dams, starting all the way back in 2019 when Representative Mike Simpson of Idaho had made a little bit of a promise, committed to restoring wild salmon and steelhead in the basin. That was during a conference in Boise, Idaho. And that really got the conversation going that, oh, geez, now we really do have the attention of Congress, or at least one congressman. And then over the next couple of years, you really saw the conversation start to mature. And then ultimately, Representative Simpson released a proposal, the Northwest in Transition proposal, which was a $33 billion proposal to move the region away from the hydro system, breaching the four Lower Snake River dams, providing the mechanism or the idea of funding those replacement services, but also economic inputs from towns throughout the basin. Lewiston here at the confluence of the Snake and Clearwater, all the way down to the Tri-Cities and the Pacific Northwest lab investments in new energy development. It really was a bold proposal that came out, and it kind of fell flat on its face. It was kind of surprising that other senators and or representatives in the Northwest didn't really glom onto it. But what we saw is that Senator Patty Murray of Washington, Governor Jay Inslee also took a leadership role in this discussion and reevaluated kind of what Representative Simpson had brought out and ultimately put forth their own recommendations. One, acknowledging that the only real way to recover salmon and steelhead in the basin is going to be breach those dams, but we need to replace those services. Fast forward today, as I noted, what's referred to as the Six Sovereigns Agreements, which is the state of Oregon, state of Washington, the Yakima Nation, the Nez Perce Tribe, the Confederate Tribes of the Umatilla, and Confederate Bands of the Warm Springs, all reached an agreement with the federal government to stay the litigation in the Lower Snake, and worked up a whole bunch of agreements and commitments, again, to move this conversation forward. That was supported by the current administration, the Biden administration. And so that's really where we are today. And we've seen this really move along in a positive fashion in replacing services. With that being said, we are still in a situation that, time is of the essence. These fish, salmon, Chinook salmon, both spring, summer, falls, steelhead and sockeye, just don't have the time. The clock is ticking. All those species are listed under the endangered species list, starting all the way back in 91 with sockeye, and completing in 97 with the listing of steelhead in the basin, and they remain there today with real noticeable change or any kind of ability to get them off the list, right? And as you mentioned in the intro, this is really about recovering wild salmon and steelhead. Those are the species that are listed. We can talk about hatchery production and why it's there and why it ends up being, a placeholder for those wild stocks. But at the end of the day, we're really trying to recover those wild stocks, into an incredible basin of habitat with huge swaths of wilderness, including the Frank Church and the Selway Bitterroot, intact habitat. Everything is there waiting for them to come back. It's just that right now with the hydro system as it is, despite all the mitigation efforts and band-aids that have been placed on the hydro system, we just can't get them recovered.
And so I just want to ask you again on, like, when you say that habitat is in place, that upstream spawning habitat is what you're referring to, as well as like the ability for the fish to travel, because it is a free flowing river above. If you take like Dworshak out of it,
Yeah.
and some old mining impoundment things, like thinking of like the Yankee Fork type of situation, fish can freely travel up and downstream once they get above lower granite.
Yes,
correct?
that's correct. And so lower granite's about 17 miles approximately downriver from the Idaho-Washington border. Once they get over lower granite, and those fish have already passed, if we're just going to talk about adults, for instance, those fish are going to pass the 4 lower Columbia dams and then get over the 4 lower Snake River dams. And then once they're into that Idaho habitat, and for that matter, portions of southeast Washington and northeast Oregon also have large expanses of available habitat. But Idaho in particular, really right now is the gold standard in habitat for cold water fisheries on the West Coast distribution of Pacific salmon. About 48% of all available cold water habitat in the range of Pacific salmon in the lower 48 exists in the Snake River Basin. And even the state of Idaho acknowledges that, despite some of these impoundments like Dworshak, about 62% of that habitat in Idaho is still intact and accessible for these fish.
And that's not really by coincidence. I mean, there's a crazy history of all sorts of different mining operations in these tributaries, which would be the spawning habitat, logging, grazing in some of these high alpine meadows that you, in personal experience, you're walking along and you go, holy shit, look at the size of that fish.
Yeah.
And so there's been a lot of changes to grazing patterns along some of those high alpine meadows, or a switch from one set of livestock to another, some rehabilitation, stream bank rehabilitation in heavily logged and mined areas, changes in those mining and logging practices, and gosh, I think it was like during the Obama administration where that area was circled on the map as a cold water reserve in North America, right?
Yeah, I think that's accurate, and it's the highest, coldest cold water habitat in the lower 48. And that's why we at Trout Unlimited are so adamant about, hey, this is the last best place to really restore and recover wild salmonids in the Snake River Basin, despite all those extractive and land use practices that has historically happened on the landscape. Uh, it shows that these fish are incredibly resilient and at times can be tolerant to those type of impacts. The one thing that they're not tolerant and resilient to is the hydro system. But if we can get them back, Trout Unlimited, we have a very large water and habitat restoration program across the United States, but even specifically here in Idaho, with a lot of effort going on in the upper salmon drainages, specifically restoring the Yankee Fork. A lot of work with our partners on the Lemhi, which is tributary there to the Salmon River right at Salmon, Idaho, all kind of creating this perfect environment, in addition to everything else that's still wild and accessible and intact for when we get these dams out. And it ends up being a totality of the life's history of a salmon, right? Not only are we, trying to restore a migration corridor, but at the same time, we're providing, the habitat for quality red building and rearing of juveniles, all the way up through the entire life history. And so that's what's really important to recognize, is that, this really is the sweet spot for restoration of the species.
Yeah, it's a pretty unique situation where there's a literal line on the map where you're like, okay, above here, we're as good as things get.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, it's no different than, a human driving out of the city, right? It's just like you're in Boise, Idaho, both of you, and I have spent a considerable amount of time there. And you think about the city when you're there, but geez, you drive what, an hour north or northeast, and you're in some of the wildest country in the lower 48. And that's kind of the analogy with these fish. It's just like, hey, we can drive out of, or they can swim out of the industrialized Columbia and Lower Snake and get into, the best of the best habitat.
You got to talk about kind of the beliefs out there that are part of the narrative to be like highly skeptical of the efficacy of removing dams, right? And just today, there was a fellow wrote in talking about Corps of Engineers information, saying that even with the removal of the lower 4 Snake River dams, we could only see an increase of about 14% of current runs. And current runs are, way below historical historical numbers, which were, very, very high. So if that's true or untrue, we should definitely cover. But
Yeah.
also, I think it gets into the bigger question of just like, if we go through all this work and these things are producing clean, affordable energy, how do we know it's going to be worth it?
Yeah.
And how do we quantify worth it?
Well, yeah, and I mean when you try to quantify something like this, you have to look at no different than what, probably the Corps of Engineers is doing right now. Uh, you have to look at all aspects of what these fish provide to the region. This isn't just about providing fish for fisheries in Idaho. The entire Columbia system would benefit by renewed fisheries. And so you look at the cultural, social, economic, and ultimately biological values associated with these renewed runs. Um, and so, many times we place value in the form of a monetary value, but sometimes things cannot be measured. I would never be able to articulate the social cultural value with a dollar figure of what these fish provide to, say, the Nez Perce tribe and its members in the Upper Basin, or the Yakimas, or the Warm Springs, or the Umatillas. I can look simply at some things. I have a friend in Chalice, Idaho, in central Idaho, that historically Chalice saw pretty good runs of Chinook and then also steelhead. And their runs have really been cut short lately, even on hatchery returns, which all these fisheries are based on right now. He owns a sporting goods shop, has for 20 years there, the bent rod, and Greg, now really doesn't carry that much fishing gear relating to salmon and steelhead. It's all more of outdoor recreation broadly, hiking and camping and stuff. And so you look at like little things like that and how that the trickle economics of what those mean to river communities like Chalice and some of the other ones in Riggins. And you can put a dollar figure on that. There's been a number of economic studies in relationship to salmon and steelhead fisheries, specifically Chinook fisheries in Idaho, and it's pretty staggering of what the economic inputs are just in Idaho. The value of the electricity, I mean, the reality is the grid is going to need more energy regardless. Those lower Snake River dams produce on average about 960 megawatts of energy is what they contribute. The real value is on demand. So when it's super hot or super cold, they can produce energy. But at the same time, we're faced with a dilemma that we need more energy in the Northwest. And so why not invest in another source outside of the hydro system that we can utilize uh, and put ourselves better off into the future while still recovering these fish. And so it's really hard to place those values on there. The other part of that, is, well, are they going to restore the fish? I think, everybody needs to be aware that the Corps of Engineers has a vested interest in these dams. It is very readily apparent, that they don't want to, I think, admit that they're salmon killers, nor take credit for the impacts of the hydro system to cultural resources of the tribes throughout the region and these salmon populations. I was at Lower Granite last week with a tour with the Nez Perce, and it oftentimes is disturbing how much misinformation or stretching of the truth and facts actually is represented by Corps Engineers folks. Multiple other ways to get that information. Again, the Corps has a vested interest in keeping those dams. You can look at the Fish Passage Center, which is a conglomeration of various entities and agencies, both state and federal, that put out what's called the Comparative Survival Study. It's a almost 30-year data set of salmon and steelhead survival through the hydro system, and evaluating all the different band-aids that have been put forth as mitigation efforts. And everything comes back to the reality. The hydro system and the dams in the hydro system are the largest mortality factor of salmon and steelhead in the Snake River Basin. And I think, you got to keep it in the context. We were just talking about Dorshak and some of the impacts throughout the basin, and right now, the bar is not to recover to historical numbers. The bar in reality is actually pretty low. NOAA, North America, or the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, convened the Columbia Basin Partnership Task Force through the late teens of of 2021 is when they finished up with their final report. And for example, if we look at spring summer Chinook in the Snake River Basin, uh, right now we're averaging for wild returns anywhere from about 7,000 to 9,500 in the entire basin. Historically, with the available habitat that is there now, it was estimated that 1 million spring and summer Chinook returned. But what the Columbia Basin Collaborative, our partnership, came up with is low, medium, and high end goals. And even the high end goal, which is 159,000 native origin or wild spring summer Chinook, is only 16% of that historical value. So we're not like reaching for the stars. It is based on the assumption that that is what you would need to have healthy and abundant fishery or populations that can support both tribal and recreational fisheries. So you really got to keep it in context, right? Yeah.
Which is hard, right? Because it's like, like that email I brought up, it's very much like, only 14%. And then on the other side of the table, it's like, holy shit, 14% would be huge.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Because it's reality. It's a massive project. There's a ton of unknowns. Lots of things have to happen. And there's 4 more dams below this area.
Yeah.
Right. Just for the returns that we were talking about.
Yeah. On the Columbia. Yeah. That aren't even part of this equation. They're not part of the discussion whatsoever. They actually contribute an immense amount of power to the overall Northwest grid and are really important. The lower Snake dams, not as much. And there's a general consensus that power can be replaced. And I think people have to go into this eyes wide open. I mean, I am not naive to this situation. I live here on the Palouse, where all this grain is produced, that is transported through the hydro system. Although I'm not a customer of BPA, I am not naive to the impacts that these, a change in electricity production would have. And so I am not, somebody that is foreign to all these conversations. It's something I take very seriously as a community member. Want to represent Trout Unlimited, but then also looking to recover these fish and the benefits that come with them. I think that people really have to take a bigger deep dive, which is really difficult at times to get the most accurate and correct information. Last year, I guess it was, last year or 2022, NOAA came out with a position paper that acknowledges the only way that we're going to recover these fish is breach of the 4 lower Snake River dams. That is based on the wide amount of scientific data that is out there, and really puts to bed, the scientific argument that, hey, we need to study more. And I hear that all the time. Well, we need to study this. We need to study that. Hey, look at this, the sea lions down below Bonneville. Look at, Caspian terns or the other avian predators down on the lower Columbia. It's always look at something else. Don't look here at the real problem. Look at something else and try to fix that first. And we've been doing it for almost 50 years and it hasn't been successful.
And those predator species are growing also. They're benefiting from, I mean, we saw it firsthand, right? It's like you create this big turbid pool that a bunch of disoriented fish get shot out of a cannon, basically.
Yeah.
And the birds and the walleye and the smallmouth bass are, lined up ready for the food train.
Yeah, and the only reason that those predators are successful is because the system is highly modified, to their favor and to a disadvantage of salmon and steelhead. So,
I mean, I still can't get over the fact that like we're sitting there in the viewing window at Lower Granite, and there's a 30-inch Chinook going upstream with 2 walleye,
yeah,
right?
and that,
And I'm like,
yeah, yeah, and as I told you, like that is really that is a really recent phenomena. 5 years ago, you'd go down there and you'd be hard pressed to see a walleye. And so now, I mean, as we saw, I mean, there wasn't just 2, there were several as we sat there and watched that were trying to make their way up, and so, I mean, yeah, I mean, it's a heavily modified system.
yeah,
Some things,
and people are just so goofy too. Like I can't wrap my head around the Pike Minnow situation. I mean, I don't think we're gonna destroy Pike Minnow, which is a native fish, and I swear to God makes great ceviche. But we're actively, with a reward system, suppressing Pike Minnow, while there's no limits on smallmouth bass or walleye, but we're not incentivizing anybody to go in there and take those fish. It's just it's just odd to me. We also caught channel cat in there, right? That was a
yeah,
channel
yeah,
cat.
yeah,
Yeah.
channel cat, yeah, in the mix. So, yeah, and as our, was it Jim? Was that our Pike
Yeah.
minnow?
Yeah,
Our
from
new friend
Florida.
Jim from Florida, as he said, he even he has seen a difference in catch rates of pike minnow. A guy that in retirement travels from Florida, and he said he comes up in May. Is that what he said? May and through September,
Yep.
right? And camps below Lower Granite just to take advantage of the pike minnow reward program in his retirement years to stay active. And what did he tell us? Made about
Made
ten
ten
thousand
thousand
dollars.
bucks. Yeah.
Yeah, caught about 1,000 pike minnow last year, I think is what he told us, and that translates to about $10,000 in a reward system. And then this year, he has 300, I think, pike minnow is what he told us. And I mean, and he, kind of blames it on, walleye that, there aren't those younger year classes. And so, not only are walleye impacting salmonids, but they're also impacting other native species. So, none the least, pike minnow that have that reward program. But, I often see lamprey in the stomach contents earlier in the season when ammosetes are out migrating. And yeah, it's kind of pretty crazy situation.
Yeah, and boy, the lamprey deal is something we got to get more into, because that's just like such a unique deal. Everybody thinks of invasive lamprey in the Great Lakes, but this is a native fish, right? And it's
Yeah,
coming all the
Pacific
way,
lamprey.
or
Yep.
yeah, coming all it's spawning in the mountains, going all the way out to the ocean, and returning, and it's just wild to see. And that was because of the fat oil content. That was a huge resource for native peoples in that river system.
Yeah, and still, is significant. No longer a significant portion of their diet, but culturally, still significant. Particularly to the Nez Perce, as we learned.
Yeah, and they their stories about lamprey are that because it is so fatty and so oily, it was the preferred prey for predator species, and they would focus on the lamprey going out and would ignore the salmon smolt going out, which was a really interesting, observation, oral history tidbit that we picked up. I thought that was really cool, because really that's the role, a huge part of the role, other than providing interest and recreation and revenue, of the current hatchery program, right? Is
Yep.
people predate on hatchery fish, let the wild fish go.
Yeah. Yeah, all fisheries within the Snake River Basin, with a little bit of an exception, are based off of mitigated hatchery returns. Yes, incidentally, wild fish may be encountered and caught, but cannot be retained. All of this is based on hatchery returns. And so people often get those numbers conflated. We have some representatives to the west of me that like to promote, historical runs. And some of that is misinformation from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and how they represent fish returns. And they conflate both hatchery and wild stocks together, and like to occasionally talk about how we're seeing historical runs and returns. Well, you ask any angler in the system, and they'll tell you right away that a one for spring Chinook, a one daily limit on spring Chinook is not a historical return. Really provides hardly any opportunity for anybody. But with the exception, we were able to go fall Chinook fishing, and because of life history and survival of fall Chinook, and the limited amount of habitat now that they actually have available to them, you can actually harvest an adipose intact fish in your 3 fish daily limit, as we saw when we were out. And so that is kind of the exception. No fisheries on Snake River sockeye. All steelhead fisheries are based on hatchery returns. And so, again, it really, you can get super focused and just really think about your tiny little window of opportunity if you're a steelhead angler, and not really pay attention at these, well, what are the wild stocks doing? What are lamprey doing? Who else benefits from these fish? And it really is an incredible opportunity and story that these fish provide to the region.
Heck yeah. I off the air, listeners, we were talking about an uncle of mine who's he's dying of cancer, and I had just come back from this trip with Eric, and we managed to catch a huge Chinook, and I took a couple of fillets over here, and he's lifelong outdoorsman, and was able to show him the picture, and he goes, "Holy shit!" And was able to get a few bites of some of that big Shinook salmon down the other night. So that was pretty cool. So that fish is still providing.
Yeah, yeah. And I said something similar when that fish finally got close to the boat, with as large as it was.
Yeah, and 465 miles from the ocean. It's just like such an amazing animal, right?
Yeah, and that's that's really the crazy thing about it. Yeah, we encountered it, and you're able to catch it at approximately 465 river miles from the Pacific, but it already made one trip out as a smolt. Spent anywhere to 3 to 5 years, which, judging by the size of that fish, it was on that cusp of being a five ocean fish, and or 5-year-old fish. And so you think about how much time it spent out in the ocean, and then made its way back.
Probably up in southeast Alaska, and
yeah,
dodged quite a few flashers and herring being drifted out there, as well as some nets, and and then all the orcas and pinnipeds, and managed to go through 8 dams.
Managed to twice. Managed to go through 8 dams.
All the way out and then all the way back in. So
and then slipped up with old Ryan Callahan.
Yep. It's wild. It really is. So I guess kind of there's a good conversation going around right now. It seems like people are, by and large, a little more willing to kind of be at the table. But kind of where are we at? Is this like if we had a call to action today, what would it be?
Yeah, the call to action is really to engage with your congressional representation, both House and Senate, uh, and the reason being is that these dams are congressionally authorized. Were congressionally authorized in the 1940 Safe Rivers and Harbors Act, and need to be congressionally authorized for removal. Um, all this effort really right now that we see with the administration and the U.S. government agreement with the six sovereigns is in preparation to really get that authorization. But uh, congressmen and women need to know that people support recovery of salmon and steelhead in the basin. Again, this isn't just about uh, Idaho fish. These fish provide an opportunity throughout the entire Columbia, below the Snake, and out into the ocean fisheries. They're not just an Idaho resource. They're really an American resource that shouldn't be taken for granted. As you noted, that fall Chinook, probably was in southeast Alaska at one point in time, but at the same time, those fall Chinook, they stay fairly close to the coast, and some go south, all the way to Northern California, and others go north. Each of these species have different ocean-like fisheries that take them all the way up into the Gulf of Alaska and all the way back, and providing opportunity everywhere. And that really has been going on, really since the advent of civilization. We had a interaction with an individual at Lower Granite, that claimed that this land, these fish belong to somebody else, and didn't really understand why the Nez Perce wanted it all back. And I reminded him, as I've been taught by Chairman Wheeler of the Nez Perce tribe, that there is documented uh, history of the Nez Perce being here for 16,000 years. So, they really were the first ones here. And so, and that's really this real long story of the opportunities that these fish have provided for the various cultures.
Yeah, and I'm not jumping over. That's an amazing fact. Like I always want to say Bonner's Ferry, but it was Glenn's Ferry, right? Is
Yeah,
the
yeah. Now you say that, I'm not sure. There is documentation within the Snake right here that is 16,000 years.
Yeah, 16,500, I
Yep.
believe.
So
Um, which is unreal, right? Like as far as like first peoples on the continent, right? We always talk like Beringia, the land bridge,
yep.
and those numbers don't jive
No,
with.
no, they don't. Not with
Yeah,
that historical record.
yeah. And Chairman Wheeler did point out um, that he's like, that's just where they stopped digging, right?
Right.
So there could be a lot more to the story, and I'm sure there is. But that like food security, food sovereignty, that one fish, three of us ate on really just one fillet. I cooked two fillets, but we ate one fillet, piece of a fillet the other night. Um, Tyler Emmett and uh, Reed Morth, they both got a couple of fillets apiece. Producer Jason Rarig got a couple of fillets. Um, I have more in the freezer right now. Like one fish provides a lot, and I didn't make stock out of the bones or anything like that. We scraped all the burger off, but um, there still was more to be done with that fish if you wanted to do it. So I mean, it's a lot of return for one of those fish, and I think about that a lot. It's especially when they're in numbers. We always used to joke in the guiding days when we'd have people be like, yeah, I just want to learn to fly cast well enough to catch fish in Alaska. And we'd be like, oh, well, you're there,
Yeah.
because
Yeah. Right.
the dirty secret about Alaska is there's so many fish, you don't need to be great at fishing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so providing that like food opportunity in these rivers that are accessible. There's so much public land right down to the river's edge. The river is public. You're providing people with some real independence, way of life type independence, if we can get these returns back high enough, right?
Yeah, and even right now, Ryan, really, I people kind of misunderstand this whole what we're fishing on. I tried to articulate it earlier, but these are mitigated hatchery returns, mitigated for the impacts of the lower snake to produce opportunity. That's what hatchery fish are here for is opportunity. And even in low run years, these fish are so heavily regulated and managed that when there are opportunities for seasons, I highly encourage people to get out there and fish for these hatchery stock. One, they provide incredible table fare, and as we talked, I mean, you could live off salmon the entire year, depending on, these runs and the cycle of runs. And they are incredible table fare. And so this isn't about like, oh, well, let's just let all those close down the fisheries and that'll help them recover. Well, that's not the case. Not the case at all. Those fish are there, mandatory mitigation from Congress of all people through the Northwest Power Act to provide opportunity and take advantage of that opportunity when it's available.
It's so crazy too because it's so highly hands-on manipulated. Like the effort involved beyond the fish doing what fish do is pretty insane. Like the fish ladder system, the willingness to truck fish, pipe fish into a truck fish above, below dams. It is a hands-on. They're damn near close enough to have like a barcode on each fish that you could scan.
Well, I mean, they almost literally have a barcode on each fish in the form of either coded wire tag from hatchery fish, and another portion of wild and hatchery fish have passive integrated tags. And that's why we, your point, so heavily managed, it is insane to know how well fisheries managers throughout the basin, this basin in particular, can predict run numbers, can update run numbers through the course of the system. Never mind, here in Idaho, they do genetic stock indexing on all wild salmonids. So spring, summer Chinook, and the steelhead stocks, that they can trace these individuals back to a specific drainage because of historical genetic data that they have. Same thing occurs tracing back individuals to hatchery parentage through fin clips and genetics. And that's the thing. I mean, this is what we've come to manage this population is technology, genetics, and band-aids. And we know enough about the system. We know enough about the mortality factors to know what direction we need to go. And that really is the removal of those fish. But in the meantime,
Yep.
take advantage of the opportunities as they exist. I mean, the last Sunday we were, out there with 100 plus other friends, right? And you really saw what these fish mean to some of these communities.
Oh, for sure. And, that's when you talk about there's going to be a massive cost associated with everything. If we're transitioning away from hydropower to replace it with small scale nuclear reactors, wind, solar, big cost on a lot of levels involved with that. Beefing up rail or trucking to compensate for the shipping of goods on barges, a lot of cost associated with that. Irrigation, what that's going to look like. Are there going to be new wells, pumps, you know, uh, aqua bypass projects, lots of cost associated with that. But one of the things that is like amazing to me and truly intriguing about the story is the tribe, the Nez Perce, they get a lot of money to run these hatcheries.
Hmm.
And they're the first ones in line saying like, yeah, it'd be great to shut these things down.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, they're dedicated to the recovery, right? And just to back up about the cost, you know, I think the listeners would be naive to think that this cost there is zero cost right now as the system is operated. The system is, incredibly expensive to run. Incredible upfront investments in building these dams, and continual operation and maintenance of these dams. Uh, it's estimated that $24 billion has been put forth in various mitigation efforts because of these dams. Uh, a full third of ratepayers' bills go towards mitigation efforts. And so, really, at the end of the day, it comes back to reimagining how we spend this money. Can we transition what these expenses are today to something different in the future? And I think the answer is yes, yes, we can, while still benefiting from a recovered population of salmon and steelhead.
Pretty cool. I think, one of the largest hurdles here is just the not knowing what it really looked like, right? Like, there's a lot of little, speaking with a bunch of people that we did in all the communities and conversations that I've had outside of that, you get all these like, oh yeah, but what if, and it's not like a real firm, this is what I'm hanging my hat on type of statement. I think it's just really a little placeholder to just kind of be like, well, how many fish are we talking about? Because, if it was like, if there was a way to just like properly equate it and be like, okay, historical looked like this in this system, that fishing hole that you go to all the time would look like this from time to time, right? Or that trip up to Alaska, or that scene out of the National Parks documentary or whatever. Like, this is what it would look like at certain times of the year. People would if you could guarantee that, like, people would be like, oh, now I get it type of thing. But we're just so far removed from that in that
It,
system.
yeah, yeah, and as we previously talked, I mean, there's no guarantees with Mother Nature. It doesn't matter what species you're talking about. There's just no guarantees.
Yep.
Uh, in this equation, the one guarantee that is out there is that if you do remove those dams, replacing all the services associated with it, you have removed that mortality factor. That is guaranteed, right? How Mother Nature reacts, we have, somewhat of a historical reference now with the removal of the Elwha Dam over on the Olympic Peninsula, the current removal of the Klamath dams in Northern California and Southern Oregon. That'll show us, and are continually showing us, that, boy, you get out of the way of these salmon and steelhead, and they will rebound. The river will cleanse itself and recover itself in due time. The ecosystem will heal itself and be as robust as it once was before man got in the way. And so we do have those track records, and those examples, even here on the West Coast, that will prove that there is a lot of opportunity here in the snake.
And so, one more time for us, Eric, if folks want to learn more, do some of their own research, read up on, kind of the high level things that we hit on today, like, where's the best place to go?
Yeah, so we at Trout Unlimited, of course, have a Snake River Campaign landing page. It's tu.org/lower snake. I'd encourage you also to look at the Columbia Basin Partnership Task Force Final Phase 2 report. That really lines out a lot of this conversation lines out the quantitative goals for various fish stocks throughout the Columbia Basin. Do your own research. Don't just take my word for it. I encourage everybody to, you know, come to their own conclusion. With a right amount of data and information from both sides of it. Again, I live here. I am ground zero for this conversation, and don't take it lightly. Yeah, I'm an avid angler. I work for Trout Unlimited. We're all about recovering wild salmon and steelhead, but at the same time, I walk into this conversation and every conversation with my eyes wide open, and know and listen to what somebody sitting across the table is telling me, and how it may impact their livelihood, may impact a family member or a friend they know. At the end of the day, Ryan, this is, we're all in this together. It's not us as in thems, it's we, and that's kind of what I remind myself. We in the region have to come to this together, and be respectful in those conversations, and really move forward with a remedy. The remedy is not behind us. We cannot continue to rely on mitigation efforts and band-aids for the impacts of the hydro system. We got to look to the future, for a better Northwest.
Heck yeah. Well, thanks a bunch for coming on. I know you'll keep us updated as new things pop up. Still a pretty long runway.
Yeah. Very long.
Yeah. But it's a great conversation, and hopefully, folks know a little bit more about some of the folks that are at the table and the interests involved. On top of that, we'll have a Cal in the Field episode coming out on YouTube, where you get to see some of this firsthand, and we got some great access. And again, big thanks to everybody there in the Lower Snake system, and the Nez Perce tribe and Trout Unlimited for letting us run around and check stuff out.
Yeah, thanks for coming in, experiencing it.
Yeah, anytime. That's all we got for you guys. Thank you so much for listening. Remember to write in to Ask Cal. That's ASKCAL. That's Ask Cal at themeateater.com. And let me know what's going on in your neck of the woods. And definitely let me know what questions you have on this subject. We're going to get into it as needed and again, I promise, because it's a fascinating one. If you have specific questions for Eric Crawford, let me know. We can always get them back on, or we can compile those and answer them on the podcast too. Thanks again. We'll talk to you next week.